Welcome everybody to the conversation today. My name is Kevin Wenzel. I'm the Director of Global Programming for Concordia, and we're thrilled that you're all able to join us, whether it's the morning, afternoon, or evening where you are. Before we begin, I wanted to start with a few general housekeeping updates for everybody on this platform. So first of all, this conversation is being recorded. It'll be available to all of you after this session as well. We also are trying out a couple of new features for audience engagement with our digital webinar series. The first is we have a couple of poll questions that we'll be using throughout this conversation. They'll pop up on your screen, and all you need to do is click your answers and hit submit. It's that easy. We also have the chat feature, which I've mentioned a few times. If you'd like to, we do encourage you to announce yourself to the entire community here, including your name, your organization, and your title, so that we know who is in our audience today. And finally, there is a Q&A feature right next to the chat button. At the end of this conversation, we'll take a few Q&A questions that have been collected from there. So if you do have any questions that come to mind during the conversation, you can submit them there. Finally, if you're new to Concordia, we welcome you. Concordia is a membership-based organization, and if you're interested in learning more about Concordia, its membership, or our events, we encourage you to reach out to us directly at membership@concordia.net after this event. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Concordia's founder and CEO, Matt Swift, to get our conversation started.
Thank you very, very much, Kevin. And on behalf of myself and my co-founder, Nick Logothetis, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining Concordia Live, our newly launched webinar series for members of the Concordia community. I'm particularly excited for this discussion this evening because we certainly could not be discussing a more timely and relevant topic. In partnership with the China General Chamber of Commerce, USA, this evening's webinar is about the road ahead around opportunities for the United States and China relations. Concordia is about cross-sector partnerships, collaborations between the private sector, the NGO sector, and yes, government. There is no question that collaboration and that cross-sector approach is critical for addressing some of the most pressing issues of our time. Concordia's mission is to foster a more collaborative world. There is no question that the latest trends in US-China relations have entered a significant level of mutual mistrust and zero-sum thinking. That is why we're hosting this webinar this evening, is because the objective here is to not pretend that we don't have some very challenging conversations ahead, but to determine key next steps around the following four elements. One, bringing about a bilateral relationship that addresses genuine issues and concerns of both the United States and China. Two, readjusting to this new normal that the entire world is facing in light of the pandemic and how we approach globalization going forward. Three, maintaining open lines where cooperation is critical. Four, leveraging partnerships as a model to rebuild the global economy. I want to stress that while debate and analysis and honest, genuine conversations is critical, that should not be a reason to not have the types of discussions we're having this evening. The two largest economies in the world must communicate, and not just between governments, but within all sectors. Thank you to the China General Chamber of Commerce USA for partnering with us on this discussion. And I want to give a very special thank you to Kevin Rudd, the president of the Asia Society Policy Institute and former Prime Minister of Australia, Andrew Liveris, former chairman and CEO of the Dow Chemical Company, who, along with Prime Minister Rudd, is a Leadership Council member of Concordia. And I'm also excited to have Bill Zaret, who recently joined Concordia as a senior advisor, and he'll be joining us as well today. He is a senior counselor at the Cohen Group and chairman emeritus of AmCham China. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the China General Chamber of Commerce, USA, Mr. Chen Zhu, to deliver welcome remarks of his own. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Mr. Swift. Honorable Mr. Kevin Rudd, Mr. Ni, Mr. Liveris, Chairman Zaret, members and friends of CGCC and Concordia. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Road Ahead, Opportunities for US and China Relations webinar. CGCC is honored to co-host this webinar with Concordia in support of a senior dialogue in the US-China business communities. At this moment, when our relationship is being challenged on various fronts, it is critical for everyone to understand the economic and strategic importance of US-China relations and how bilateral trade represents an integral and beneficial part of the overall economic relationship. Many officials and those in the media have a tendency to forget economic, scientific, and technological gains the world has achieved through globalization and cooperation with China. 40 years of cooperation has not only alleviated poverty for over 800 million Chinese people, but has brought local and worldwide consumer prices down, increased manufacturing efficiencies, developed state-of-the-art transportation across land, air, and sea, advanced technologies in virtually every industry, and given enormous market share to foreign companies to sell products to an immensely growing middle class in China. At the CGCC, we strive to create opportunities to expand Chinese investments in the US and trade between the two countries. In our annual business survey on Chinese enterprises operating in the US, we were very happy to see that amid challenges from political uncertainties and market volatility, Chinese companies hold strong confidence in the overall US market. We also know that US companies are still confident in China's future growth. Nevertheless, it is no secret, nor should it surprise anyone, that our nations continue to have a profound trade policy disagreement. Recent legislative proposals, and the rhetoric from certain officials and members of the media has created major concern for both US and Chinese corporations. How can we navigate the current political environment and clarify to various stakeholders that the cooperation between the two largest economies in the world creates massive benefits for both countries? It also creates stability in the markets and it can be achieved without sacrificing national security. It is my sincere hope that we can address and provide some solutions regarding these issues here today. Decoupling, disengagement, or whatever term one prefers, will no doubt double, if not triple, the cost for American companies and consumers. While the relationship will have its challenges going forward, and the competition between our two nations will continue in certain areas. We believe that through open dialogue and cooperation, there will be more opportunities and benefits for business, workers, and consumers on both sides of the Pacific. As will, in fact, be critical in a post-COVID-19 world to once again achieve economic prosperity for both our nations and the peace around the world. I thank all of those attending and welcome your remarks and suggestions today and any day as we build a brighter future together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And now, while he was unable to join us live, we have a few opening contextual remarks from Leadership Council member and former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd.
First point I'd make is that as someone who's been active in the China analysis business since I was a foreign service officer in Beijing in the mid-1980s, I have not seen the US-China relationship in such fundamental disrepair for the length of my diplomatic and political career. We are now at least a 30-year low, if we use Tiananmen in 1989 as our benchmark, and possibly approaching a 50-year low, as it will soon be 50 years since Kissinger's path-breaking visit to Beijing on secret diplomacy in 1971. So how have we got to this, and what can we do about it for the future? The first point I'd make about the structural dimensions of the US-China relationship is that because of the changing relativities in national power between China and the United States, it follows almost as a matter of strategic logic that strategic competition is going to emerge, not just in economics, but also in raw national security, as well as the drivers of both the above, principally technology. There's a further dimension to this great power competition as well, and that, of course, is an emerging and sharp ideological debate between the two countries as well. Liberal democracy versus authoritarian state capitalism. So those are the structural factors at work. But beyond these structural factors, which are to do with the changing balance of power between China and the United States and the great power disequilibrium which now exists, there are other, let's call them subjective factors to do with the diplomacy and politics of both Trump's America and Xi Jinping's China. Trump's America has been, obviously, by definition, America first, but on top of that, increasingly nationalist and increasingly protectionist. And we've seen, of course, the impact that has had through the US-China trade war. And whatever the merits or demerits of the trade war were, the net consequences on the overall fabric of the US-China relationship has been to render it increasingly threadbare. The level of economic decoupling, which was beginning to occur prior to the COVID crisis, has now been compounded. On the Chinese side of the equation, Xi Jinping, since around about the end of 2013, has consciously and deliberately set out to pursue a more nationalist and assertive policy towards the United States. And you see that not just in the South China Sea, but you see that across the length and breadth of China's global and not just regional diplomacy. So, international relations, like personal relations, it does take two to tango. And that's the admixture we see at work between Beijing and Washington right now. How do you best characterize, therefore, the relationship as we enter the third decade of the 21st century? Some have said it's a new Cold War. I'm not quite there yet, but I have, in a recent article I've written less than 2 weeks ago in Foreign Affairs magazine, described it as Cold War 1.5. And the reason I say that is America will emerge from the post-COVID world as a diminished power, both in terms of the objective strength of its economy, but also international reputational damage it will suffer as a result. But China too emerges as a diminished power because of the origins of the virus and, frankly, the way in which China's wolf warrior diplomats have conducted themselves across the world, as well as the significant hit on China's economic power. But because in this new environment, we see increasing evidence of an economic decoupling between the two countries, we begin to see the evidence of a Cold War type relationship. The one major thread holding these two countries together so far has been the enmeshment of the two countries' financial markets. But when I see recent developments in the United States in particular towards US pension funds not investing in Chinese equities, and when I begin to see China hedging against the possibility of technological, economic, and financial decoupling by the United States, we begin to start on the slow trajectory and perhaps an accelerating trajectory towards a serious Cold War 2.0. I'll leave my remarks there.
Okay, and now to our main conversation for this afternoon. In addition to Andrew Liveris and Bill Zaret, who Matt Swift introduced at the beginning of this, I'd like to welcome Mr. Ni, Vice Chairman of the CGCC and President of the Wansheng America Corporation, to this conversation, along with our moderator, Peter Reisman, Co-Chair of Government and Public Relations at the CGCC and Managing Director and Chief of Communications Officer at Bank of China USA. Peter, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, I think we got you.
Sorry.
There we go.
Still on mute? There we go. Sorry, this is the first webinar that I'm moderating for such a large group, so still getting used to it. But Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining this virtual forum. I think it's going to include some extraordinary insight from those who have really been serving on the front lines of U.S.-China relations and business and trade investments for decades. I started my career in study in China back in the 90s, and I very much share the Honorable Kevin Rudd's concern regarding the state of affairs that we are currently in our relationship. And fortunately, I've been working both with the Chamber and with the bank, and seeing how we can build better relationships and increase cooperation. Real quickly, I will just say that CGCC is honored to co-host this webinar with Concordia as part of its CGCC eConnects, which is an online program that really enables our members to share information, industrial reports, and webinars to really increase the amount of information that's out there in the public. I think we've seen many times a lot of misinformation, both in the media and out on the internet. And so it's forums like these that, together with Concordia, really bringing a star panel together that I think will be beneficial in educating the public about the real issues and facts between the US and China. So with that, I will not dive deep into the bios of the panel that I have in front of me. All of them come from extraordinary backgrounds. I think that's included in your materials. And I really prefer to go right into the question phase with my esteemed panels, because that's what everybody is here to hear. So I'm going to start with the Honorable Bill Zaret. Bill, are you there?
I am.
All right, so Bill, we're going to start with a couple questions for each panelist. And then what I'm going to do is open up to a couple general questions for the entire group that everyone can choose to answer from or not answer from. And really, we're just going to be tapping into the knowledge and experience that you all bring to the table and have worked so hard to build in your relationships between the US and China. So Bill, as someone who has represented the American business community in China and is experienced in navigating the evolving business environment there, to what extent has recent US policy toward China been effective in addressing American business community interests? What would you really recommend at this point to both American and Chinese policymakers to effectively address the areas in commercial relations? I might add that while Chinese investment in the US has dropped considerably, there still seems to be a steady flow of capital flowing into China. And so how do we reconcile where we are and really what strategies should companies be looking at in this environment and going forward?
Well, that's a
5-hour lecture right there alone.
I will be as brief as appropriate, I hope. First of all, I'm very excited to be on this panel with Andrew Liveris and Mr. Nipien, two superb business people. And thank you to Concordia and to you, Peter. First of all, what I'd like to do is just give it a little context, and I'll run through this quickly, but I think it's important for us to have this. You know, since we normalized relations with China, the US and China, and especially since China joined the WTO, we've had issues. Protectionism on the Chinese side, closed markets, IP violations, window guidance, of course, being unwritten rules doing business, which usually were to the detriment of US companies in China and other issues. So we've had these issues a long time, but let's face it, we had a grand bargain. We were getting goods less expensive, our consumers, our companies were making money, consumers getting cheap things, inexpensive things, and even our politicians, I think, were doing okay with getting their constituents more bang for their buck. But in the 20 teens, the mid 20 teens, things started really to change. Reform and opening up basically stopped. Of course, reform in Western parlance is not the same thing as the Chinese idea of reforming the SOEs, but still there were reforms over the years, but that it slowed way down. And something we need to thank Xi Jinping for. You know, we all often complain that China's not transparent, but with the Made in China 2025 policies, which is focusing on developing national champions in 10 very important industries of the present and the future, we were apprised of what China is doing. And so using preferential loans, subsidies, protection of the domestic market, we saw that when these companies would go international, it would be tantamount to a company competing against a country. So US business advocating for open markets, national treatment, IP protection, level playing field. And although I don't agree with a lot of the tactics of the US administration's approach to this issue, businesses in general, at least in the American Chamber when I was chair, and still appreciate that we actually addressed the issues. For many years, we had been talking about this, but very little progress really had been made to hold China's feet to the fire. So now, what do we do about it? You know, we've gotten ourselves into a pickle here with, I think, with the tactics that were used by this administration. I think it could have been done better. But I know that the AmCham China and also the US Chamber and China Business Council and other associations are working very hard to keep what we have of this relationship, which has really been the glue, the commercial relationship has been the glue of the bilateral relationship for years. Just lastly on this, I want to share with you what we are saying in the American Chamber of Commerce representing 3,000 members. We are meeting with legislators, think tanks, companies in Washington, DC. We have to do it virtually this year. But basically, the talking points are the importance of this relationship. Yes, we want a level playing field. The economic systems of both countries, neither country is going to change. So we have to assume that and work with that and work with like-minded countries to address the differences, address the challenges, and come up with something that is fair and acceptable to both sides. The US really needs a strategic approach, and I'm getting a little more optimistic with that strategic approach, which before it has been really ad hoc. And we're really urging the US not to do policies that will hurt the US and US companies, like the tariffs have hurt.
Bill, I'm gonna interrupt you there for a moment, and really that leads into my second question. When you talk about talking points and meeting with congressmen and policymakers, you know, we're now hearing much more a concept that when I was studying in China in the 90s and probably for the last 30 years would never have imagined. And you've built up these relationships, but the concept of decoupling, where it's not really sort of, is it really leveling the playing field, or is there a retrenchment here going on? There's a push by clearly the hawks on certain sides to decouple the economies. And, you know, what is your view on that, and how do you approach the people that you're talking to in DC in reconciling that with?
Yeah, and I'll be very brief on this. Yes, it seems that there are certain products, technologies for which it makes sense to have this so-called decoupling or protecting national interest, whether it is IT And as we're realizing more and more now, perhaps in the medical area and a few other areas, this is inevitable. But we have to also remember that decoupling started before decoupling was really a term. As costs were going up and other obstacles doing business in China, companies started to diversify supply chains and to, in some cases, move operations. Well, the trade war exacerbated that. We figured about 10 to 15% of the companies had either moved a supply chain and or moved operations. But what we've seen now since COVID-19 is that that percentage has gotten into the 25 to 30% range of US companies in China that are diversifying supply chains and or moving operations. And I think that this is inevitable. What we urge is that this be done on the policy side strategically and clear-eyed and intelligently, because the relationship, the benefits that our country receives, that companies receive, is so great that the idea of wholesale decoupling, it would be very, very harmful to both countries.
Andrew, I'm going to turn to you right now. Are you on off mute?
Let me unmute.
No,
Can you
that's
hear me?
good. That's good. That's good. I'm going to turn to you. As I understand, and I've looked at your bio. Quite an extraordinary history you've had. But as someone who U.S. presidents, as I understand, from both political parties have really sought advice from in reviving domestic U.S. manufacturing. Could you speak a little bit to this prerogative, how this fits in the overall picture of U.S.-China trade relations? I mean, one common theme I seem to often hear is that, you could move some manufacturing to the ASEAN countries, but, friends of mine say they've tried to look and you don't get the same infrastructure or labor. It's just not that easy to do. And many also don't want to give up on the Chinese domestic market. So from really all of your experiences, both at Dow and IBM and everywhere else, what's your take on this?
Well, thank you. And I thank Concordia and obviously the learned comments of all the speakers so far, inclusive of my fellow panelists. So I thank you also for the commentary on my resume. I first went to Hong Kong as a young man when I was 21, and I've been to China in my 20s, 30s, 40s, and now well into my 60s. Every decade I've seen up close and personal, 21 years in total, working in Hong Kong over 4 different assignments as a Dow person, as a Dow young engineer, all the way to running the entire region, and then going into the White Swan Hotel in what was then called Canton and negotiating with people dressed in the Mao uniforms pre-Deng Xiaoping, and the massive opening of the last 30 years under the opening policies of his reforms. The changes Bill's already alluded to were happening well before the arrival of President Trump. And what I've noticed, certainly President Obama and the Manufacturing Council I co-led there, and then on to President Trump, the arrival of the awakening of the U.S. body politic, as witnessed by the voting of the factory workers that in Dow factories, wandering around Michigan and Texas and other parts of this country. Dow is a strong U.S. presence, obviously. It was very clear that they felt disaffected and the blame was being put on China. Mexico too, but certainly the blame game and the finger pointing spoke to an economic dis-synergy that now was removing the economic synergy that was spoken to by Bill and Kevin Rudd and others. What was that? The U.S. consumer fueled the Chinese factory, and the Chinese factory is mostly built with U.S. technology. That grand bargain, whether it was conscious or unconscious, was the synergy that we had for 3 or 4 decades, depending on how you count. Global manufacturers like Dow were always very cautionary about what technology they put on the ground in China because of the loss of technology that became the IP wars. The IP wars and protection in China of technology really started to dictate the differentiation and the competitive advantage of all global manufacturers who sought to go to China. The labor arbitrage, long lost. coastal cities, way expensive. Going inland didn't really serve market. Capital arbitrage, we had already lost that. The Chinese banks and the state-owned enterprises were given fundamentally subsidized capital. We were losing that. If you were a US public company, you were being measured by New York Stock Exchange metrics. That disequilibrium was already occurring. But the arrival of the disequilibrium of technology, as China developed its own technology, powerful technology, as they had their own R&D labs, as the state-owned enterprises became leaders in key areas like telecom and you name it, IT and batteries and solar, we were losing the technology wars country versus country. That realization, that aha moment, could be corrected in one of two ways if you're a global company. One way under President Obama was, whoa, just a second, we need to go and react and build our own technology capabilities in the technologies of the 21st century. So the beginning, some generations before, Bell Labs and, all the labs that the US had, the national labs, were at the core of building what was US entrepreneurial technologies and, in the area of IT. This loss, this time around, it was being corrected by our approach in manufacturing in the United States to build to compete. The model that has come as under President Trump was, you know what, we can't beat state-owned enterprises. It's US companies versus China Incorporated. We are competing against the country, not a series of companies. Different economic rule books. And so if you're sitting there and you are a US company operating globally and China being a key market, you started to have to make the decision. And I was chair of US Business Council on a panel where I said the decision being made by most of us, we don't realize it yet, is with this economic dyssynergy and the beginning of separation of these two systems, we have to now almost decide, are we a US company that operates globally, or are we a global company that happens to have its headquarters in the United States? The latter is what we've been operating on for the previous 3 or 4 decades. The former is where we are right now. And I believe there's remedy to that. And I believe the remedy, lies in the core of business, understanding that it's really a technology game today, that digital has basically killed all borders, as we're seeing with this very webinar. What we very much have to do, in my view, as businesses, is go to the numerator and find out how a win-win can occur with separation and a dyssynergy between these two great nations that will progress through the 21st century and be behemoths in their own right. In some respects, this separation could lead to amplification of their respective economic powers. Hopefully it doesn't move over to the military side, but certainly the economic side, it will lead to a decision on how to win in separation, not.
So how do you, let me interrupt that at that point. So how do you then view what's your current assessment of the US-China trade negotiations over the last several years with the tariffs? We had a phase 1 deal signed in January. Where are you on the negotiations and what we can or should be doing a better job with?
Yeah, look, if we lived in a fantasy world, people like me in my business life would prefer that everything be done in private negotiations, prefer that the rhetoric, was not out there in the press, would prefer that the destabilization was not occurring. And that is truly a fantasy, because what people like me and, in business chairs don't understand, in a democracy, it's the voting booth that actually dictates the rhetoric. And the disaffection and the dissatisfaction of the US population on the current grand bargain of the US being the protector of the world and the subsidizer of the Chinese renaissance, which is really the perception that's out there. Whether you call that a reality or not is irrelevant. So because of that, we are using 20th century tools in the 21st century economy. The blunt instruments of tariff and tariff protection is what being used right now to reestablish the economic equilibrium between these two great nations. If you're a business person, you've got to accept that as a reality, embrace it, because then you've got to start making choices on how to operate in that sort of paradigm. That paradigm, right or wrong, is not for the business people like me to say, look, you should go and negotiate this way. We're not elected to elected office. We're not the ones undertaking it. in some respects, and I'll say this, it's pretty controversial, by doing it in the public domain, US businesses now have sudden leverage in China that they never had before. Remember what I said in my previous comments, US company versus China as a nation, that's unfair competition. Now we have the US saying these statements that actually provides air cover. I think there's remedy to this, but I'll leave it to maybe the next question. I think there's ways forward for business in navigating this, but you've got to embrace that reality that the population base of the United States as we sit here today, and we have elections coming up, obviously, sees this as a win for the US and really doesn't care about it being a loss for China. And the last thing they care about is the effect on US businesses in China.
Yeah, I think that we're going to get to the U.S. Election year roundtable, if you will, in a minute. But I want to turn to Nipin right now as someone who has really built an incredible corporation here in the United States, really from 0 to $4 billion in revenue. How has these past trends and policies affected Wanxiang's business, and how would you advise other, certainly the current investments from China and the US are down to a minimal, but as Chinese investors do look at the US economy, what would you advise them looking at current policies?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, this is my great honor to be able to join this panel discussion, and thanks to Concordia as well. You're right. We have been here since 1994. That was the same year GM went to China, and so for that many years, and honestly speaking, until recently, I would say as long as you don't read the newspaper, you don't watch TV, you're fine. And this is a life as normal, and you're in the Midwest. You're not on the East Coast or West Coast. So focus on the business and hire more people, pay the tax, and you're welcome. So that was, I would say, even there's a lot of controversial, debate and a lot of political, power struggle, whatever it is. And business-wise, I would say it's pretty much as normal until, I would say this pandemic definitely has changed a lot of things. I'll give you one example. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with a professor from Northwestern University. And he was very concerned about, in his lab, he has Chinese scholars, he has people, whether they're American already, they're working in his lab and so forth and so on. And he clearly stated that people were concerning about their future. And obviously, when you are in a little hostile environment, everything is getting very uncomfortable. So he's saying that those people are expressed their concern to him and talking about to quit a job here and move back to China. To me, that's the fundamental threat. That's a bigger issue. So in terms of, answer your second question, what can we do? I still believe, just as the two, Bill and Andrew was talking about, fundamentally, the decoupling is not the solution, and that we have to find a way to work together. And the working together definitely benefited the people in these two countries. So now the question is there a way we can really, under the circumstances today, can we really stabilize, at least from the business point of view, can we stabilize? And I would say, nothing is more frustrating than when you do have a good cause, but due to the communication or ineffective communication, you build those bigger gaps. So that is something I would say, this panel, as well as many others, and probably can play a role here. And I'm just going to use one example, right or wrong. I would say in China, there's a reality, there's the intention, but between the two is the communication, that you can bring the reality together with the intention. Just, I'm going to use the copyright as an example. No doubt, China had a lot of issues, And even for us, at the beginning, we want to keep all the technology in the United States because, the copyright or the IP protection was not adequately available, just like here. But I would say the intention clearly is still there because, I shared this example. We had to shut down Caterpillar, we had to shut down Volkswagen because the Chinese custom blocked the shipment. Say, you cannot put their the logo on your product unless we have the approval, which we present them the approval many different times. And from the company, from their legal counsel, and it's just a lot of steps you have to go through. So I would say the intention was there, trying to protect the copyright. Although, let me be honest, this protecting the copyright is, I always say this, is not a U.S.-China issue. It's China domestic issue. It's not, just the China domestic issue today, but it's for the China's future. When I talk to a lot of business people there, everybody say the same thing. And they say, no matter how, we're going to have to do it anyway. But still, somehow, there's a bigger disconnection in terms of communication. The message has not got through. That's the frustration. And but as long as we, get a good communication going, I would say, from business point of view, just like Andrew was talking about, we trying to avoid this tariff issue. We trying to move the plant outside of China. And we went to many different countries. Last year, I was in Turkey, India, we went to Mexico, many other countries, we take a look at it. And it is still very challenging. We're still working with USTR office, trying to file the extension for those exclusions, because so far we have not been able to find adequate substitute as competitive as we want them to be. So
I think that goes to one of my earlier points. It's just a lot of companies, while they feel the pressure from the U.S. Government, China just happens to do it much better, and they create a great product. But I want to step in for a moment and talk about, when you talk about communications, you've done an enormous amount of work with the U.S. government and foundations to promote Americans going to China for overseas study. I think the COVID-19 will probably create some problems as far as more students going to China, some anxiety as far as studying in China in the present future. But, what advice do you give, or how do you see the impact in the number of foreigners or Americans going to China and training the next generation of communicators and business leaders? How do we bridge that gap? I don't think we're seeing enough in that level of understanding that you've all built.
Yeah, so we always believe, this is people to people subject, right? It's not necessary today. It's more about 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. As long as we have mutual understanding, it's always improving the communication. And the one example I give all the time, when we even have a delegation coming from China, when we're picking them up at the airport, we will say, oh, it's nice weather here. It's a 72 degree outside. And the delegation was scared to say, wow, that's too hot. How could that be? And because they're talking about the C, we're talking about F. They have no clue what a Fahrenheit, at a 72 means to them. And they don't even know how to pick the dress they need. So those communication, if you understand on both sides, then it's a lot easier, no doubt. And I remember, the survey we did about those students that go to China, and then we say, what do you learn about China? Interesting part is everybody say, oh, there's no fortune cookie in China. We saw that it was invented by the Chinese in China. So anyway, so there's a lot of those kind of disconnection. But answer your question, how do we do that? I would say there's still a lot of, way, especially in today's environment, Zoom meeting is one of the examples. Today, if we, get sent to I think the Zoom is invented by a Chinese American, out of San Francisco. And it's popular used in China as well. So there's many other ways we can get people connected. And we're working with a couple of other companies who are trying to help even teaching the English in China through online system. So I would say, between these two countries, And we do have a fundamental connection, or the glue, I think values. And the glue is still between people to people. The glue is still, the business exchange in the way that really it's a benefit of those companies as well as the people on both sides.
I think that's very true. I think the people-to-people connection has really been the backbone of the relationship. Certain things we see at the sort of national or federal levels are very different than what you see at the state and provincial levels. And that's really going to take me into a question really for anybody here, either Andrew, maybe Bill, being in, very entrenched as far as the thought process and what's going on in DC. We're in an election year right now, and in every election year that I can recall in the last 20 years, it turns out to be a food fest or China bashing, and seeing who can top one another. How do we survive or thrive, if you will, in advancing our cooperation or understanding, and whether or not so that's up until the election. And do you think that things will change depending on whether President Trump is reelected, or former Vice President Biden is elected? Maybe let's start with, maybe let's start with Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. And I listened very intently to Mr. Nee's commentary. And so I think the short answer to your question is, if we see President Trump lose the election and it goes to the Democrats, so Vice President Biden, I do think you're going to see some movement back to the center ground. And maybe the public rhetoric will go down, and then you'll get to more private negotiations. However, you don't fix the fundamental issue that I talked about in my opening remarks or your opening questions. The fundamental issues remain no matter who's the president of the United States. And that is, we have to redefine what economic coupling looks like. And in terms of the first part of your question, I believe businesses can play a very big role in that. I think that whether they're businesses like Mr. Nee's or businesses like Dow, we actually have got a long history. I grew up internationally at Dow by understanding this whole premise that it's a values-based proposition when you go to another country. And if the standard in that country is not the standard of the country you've come from, not mostly the US, you actually bring that country to the same standard. It's a values-based, standards-driven business strategy. And to do that in this sort of political reality means you've got to actually manage your risks. I've talked about the biggest risk today being technology. Really, we need to step up and redefine what relationship management is, people to people, company to company, to reestablish the value proposition economically that is fundamental to the value proposition of a people relationship. These two great countries will have relationships. It's just being reestablished to a new norm. I think businesses can actually drive and get ahead of the geopolitical retrenchment. In other words, we can advance ahead and be the leaders, okay, in establishing this. And in the US, with the Business Roundtable's proclamation on stakeholders need to be all evaluated equally, not just shareholders. I know that's a crazy thought in a mercantile capitalistic environment, but this is our license to operate. And whether it's a global pandemic or in fact all the natural disasters, bushfires here in my home country of Australia, we are now at the forefront of unbelievable change. Technology disruption, environmental disruption, health and hygiene disruption, and then geopolitical disruption. You throw all those factors into the mix. If you're on the board of a public company, if you aren't managing risk across all your stakeholders in the US-China relationship, meaning turn up, build the relationships, build the business-to-business connection to reestablish the economic proposition, I think that goes right through an election. Because who gets elected the next time is another political uncertainty. We've got to create economic certainty out of political uncertainty.
Bill, I'm going to give you a chance just to respond very briefly, because I do want to leave some time for some questions. Kevin, do we have questions that are going to be coming in?
I've actually seen a few.
We do.
Have come in. I agree that if the Democrats win, well, I'm hoping and I'm assuming that the approach will be more communication, more strategic, more reasonable in dealing with the bilateral relationship. I think one thing that is not going to really do that much to help is the phase one. And we can talk a lot about phase one, but just basically, the phase one agreement does not approach the essential problem, the essential challenge, the essential contradiction, which is the state capitalism versus market-based economic system. So I'm also hoping that if the Democrats do come in, that this will be the focus, and that, as Andrew has said so very well, that it will be a building of relationship and taking everyone's voices into consideration. There is a way to deal with these two systems. We just have to have some statesmanship, which we're very short on right now.
Okay, Kevin, do you want to throw out a question there from the audience, since you're monitoring that side of the forum?
Sure, we've got a lot of questions coming in. The first one is the most one that's been brought up, I think, because it just happened today. A lot of people are asking about Secretary Pompeo and the State Department announcing that Hong Kong no longer has autonomy under China. There's no specific question. They're just looking for comments from people in terms of what the repercussions of this might be, or thoughts around that recent development today in the news.
Bill, would you like to give it a shot?
Yeah, I think we don't know what it means. I think we know that we're posturing, and of course the Chinese having stepped in to China. We think that they'll be passing a law that will take away some of the rights of the people in Hong Kong, and we know that's going to happen. It's the response of the U.S., I think, how this will affect the people in Hong Kong, and how it will affect, I'd say that number one. Number two, how it will affect business, U.S., Hong Kong. So if the U.S. decides, well, we no longer have a duty-free relationship, that's going to a stultifying effect on the bilateral trade that we have now with Hong Kong. Investment, it could also have that effect. So we don't know what's going to happen yet. And what I'm hoping is that we will take into consideration, our policymakers will take into consideration the benefits, the values of the Hong Kong people and the good of the Hong Kong people in making any decision that they make.
I want to leave time, Kevin, for more questions. I have more questions that I would love to ask, but I just want to give due time.
Sure, we've got maybe one more, and then if you've got one to throw in, go ahead.
Yep.
This one is from Leslie Arnold in the Washington, D.C. office of BHP. As you may know, we do significant business in China. We would be interested to hear any insights you might have about potential action against China, potential sanctions-related issues that might impact our customers, LC banks, etc.
I think Andrew or Nepian, would you like to take a shot at that?
You need to be on mute.
Andrew, you're on mute still.
No, he's not.
Unmute. Okay.
There
Sorry,
you
I didn't want to waste time. I'll be very quick. I think any provider of goods to China has to prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. And so I mentioned risk management in the boardroom. I'd be doing a lot of risk management about how to keep your trade alive during this period of time of great economic uncertainty. I think the recoupling is going to take a few years, maybe two election cycles. And I think there'll be steps back before there's steps forward, as witnessed by the Hong Kong action.
So,
Nepian?
I had a couple of comments. One is that in the Chinese world, and crisis, the first letter is the danger, the second letter is the opportunity. So while this is definitely will be very difficult time. However, on the other side, I would say we have to go back to the fundamentals. Whether it's in the United States, whether it's in China, in other part of the world, the political environment always change. It could change anytime, but the business fundamental is still the same. So the question is, I call this is the gravity. So is the gravity still there? Is there going to be a potential market for you to go there? And if that is, then take this as an opportunity. And while everybody's scared, everybody couldn't go there, maybe you're going to be the unique one. And as long as you manage this with transparency, with professionalism, and follow the rule, and then I don't think, that's how we started the business here. And I don't think there's going to be an issue eventually, because if I would hope, those leaders on both sides will recognize, and they should, that by working together is the only way that solve the global problem. I mean, this pandemic is no doubt to give us a good lesson. When you have a global crisis, you need to have a global solution. Global solution means that you only need you should have more cooperation, not the confrontation. So I think in the long term, short term when it's difficult, long term may bring you more opportunity.
I agree. I mean, I think what I fear in this relationship is the possibility of American companies losing market share in China. And so I advocate for more engagement and for American companies to continue. It's a massive consumer market. It has an aging population. There are still many opportunities, and the Chinese government, I think, has done a surprising, I think, to many, a good job in opening up its financial markets now, in lowering some of its tariffs, and creating more opportunities for foreign investment. If American companies don't take advantage of that, there will be somebody else who will fill in that void. But Nipin, I may want to ask you one more question, and could even throw it out to the group. We are seeing, because of the rhetoric that's out there, this certain xenophobia that's increasing in the American public eye. And you've built a lot of companies in the Midwest. Sometimes I feel like in New York we're in a little bit of a bubble. What are you seeing out there in the Midwest? Last year we ventured off to Kentucky and Ohio, and it still seems that there is welcome for Chinese investment. How do you see it?
Yeah, I would say, from business point of view, there's not hugely different. I just be honest with you. I like to cry as well, but honestly, USA has a great system, and this is a very much open market. It's a free, and so I would say everything is from a fundamental point of view, we don't really haven't seen anything significant different. Obviously, as I mentioned, if you read the newspaper, you watch TV, you get scared. No doubt. But other than that, I would also just add one more comment to say there is perception versus reality. So the perception, again, like here, I'm saying, we're fine, and we may have more IRS coming here, and we may have more, U.S. Customs want to look at us, but that's fine. That's what we have to follow anyway to start with. So there's nothing wrong with that at all. So it's not a discrimination, it's not a special attention, it's just the way you conduct business. And I would say the perception versus reality is the same thing as Peter, you just mentioned about, in the last couple of years, China reduced the tariff and they tried to open up more. Again, this is not a US-China issue, it's a China domestic issue. Even you look at all this, we talk about this technology, this AI, this digital, all those things. Look at China, who are the driving force for those subjects? Largest force is the private business, not the state-owned business. And you can talk about, Alibaba, you can talk about Tencent, you can talk about all those digital AI business involved today. Hardly you can say a state-owned dominating player there. So China is changing as well. So I'm just saying, from perception and reality, it could be very far from each other. And unfortunately, newspaper, You use the perception, you create a perception, and you enhance that perception. Now you create your own enemy, which is not necessary. That's the reason I'm saying the communication is so important. We need to show the reality. And like, Chinese investment in the United States, I know it's terrible. Everybody's scared. I'm trying to tell everybody, there's nothing to be really scared about. And as long as you pay the tax, you hire people, you'll be all right. People are very friendly. We just brought like more than 1 million masks to the 12 states in the Midwest. I got the 3 governors send us a letter, really appreciate for all the donation we gave to the state. And it's not a lot of masks, honestly speaking, but people are really, really appreciative to the relationship. So that's what we need to deliver as a message.
I think you're right. I think that's the backbone. Kevin, I'm going to use my authority we just have an incredible panel here. I want to get some closing thoughts or comments. Leave it as a free for all for Bill, Andrew, and Nepean. It's an incredible future we have ahead of us. It's challenging. There are issues. I do think that they can be resolved. But it requires enormous amount of communication and facts and information. So let me start with Nepean, and then we'll go to Bill, and then we'll close with Andrew, and then Kevin, of course, you can close for everybody.
Yeah. So I would say, we're all, no matter how, we're all the beneficiary of the healthy U.S.-China relationship. So, from that point of view, we have to do our own job, and we have to contribute to the build out of this relationship. And, I'm living in the Windy City, so I always call the political wind is very unpredictable. And it could blow this direction, could blow that direction. And there's not a lot of things we can do with this wind. But what we can do is fundamentally focus on what we do and behave as what we should behave and contribute to the community. If you are not together with the community, you're gonna be blown off. But if you have deep roots, if you are in the community, whether the American company in China or Chinese company in the United States, as long as you become part of the community, and I think we should all be very safe.
Bill, do you
Sure,
mind?
and I know that Mr. Nee he walks the talk, and he's been very successful in the U.S. by being part of the community. I would just say to companies, I will take that angle. If you know, you got to know the market, you got to know the Chinese market, which is a challenge, but it's critical. You have to know which way the leadership is leaning, and we just had the 2 meetings. So you have to know what's coming, because it's pretty clear the direction that they want to go. And I think let's say for US companies, for Western companies in general, this is a time when the Chinese are understanding that they do need foreign investment. They understand that foreign investment will help boost the economy. So I don't think this is a bad time to get involved, but you really need to know what you're doing.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think there's 3 points I want to make if I'm sitting in a boardroom and I'm a CEO of a company that operates with the view towards being in the US and China market, keyword being and, okay? It's doable, okay? And you've got to, as Mr. Nepe was saying, embrace your reality. I think the 3 things I would seriously consider in a conversation on strategy and a pivot to accommodate this reality, because I don't believe this reality is going to go away. Number 1, participate locally more than ever. Economic nationalism is here to stay. Number 2, we are coming out of a pandemic that is resetting economic behavior massively. We haven't spent any time on that in this panel, but that massive tectonic shift has effects, some plus, some minus. The minus we haven't yet seen is the pullback of Chinese funds from the US. That's going to create economic credit issues, okay, in the supply chain. So be the first friend to your supplier, or if you're a supplier, to your customer in this bilateral relationship. So get to the economic reality as fast as you can and mitigate those effects as fast as you can. And 3, economic alliances are going to be the next 5 to 10 years. There's going to be subsets of economic alliances that you can't predict yet. The sequestering of Hong Kong is the beginning of China fortifying its economic border. Belt and Road was the first harbinger of that. We are seeing clustering around the China model and clustering around the US model. You can't ignore it. Go after it as an opportunity.
I think that's all great advice. I think I'm just going to close my comment and simply say that it's obvious that the 21st century is no doubt going to be determined on whether our two nations are going to take a more cooperative approach, strategic cooperation, even some competition, or the opposite in really solving our bilateral and even multilateral challenges that we have in the world. I know that CGCC will continue to work with business communities, state and local governments, and other nonprofit partners like Concordia to really facilitate this type of exchange and connecting people and building trust and expanding cooperation. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Kevin. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank CGCC and Concordia. Really an incredible conversation that can go on for hours and hours. And maybe we will do another round like this in the coming weeks or months ahead. So I look forward to it.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to CGCC. And we definitely will be continuing this conversation. So please stay in touch with both CGCC and Concordia as we keep this conversation moving into the future. Thank you all for attending, and please be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.